We are Teachers College, the first and biggest school of education in the nation. Here, in a single square block in the heart of New York City, we have invented and reimagined the modern K-12 classroom and the community school. And we're also leaders in advancing human health and well-being. Teachers College launched the fields of nursing education and nutrition education. Our faculty have focused policymakers on health disparities that hinder student achievement, introduced new approaches to helping youth make more considered choices about sex and parenting, and revealed the connections between poverty and brain development in young children. This week, as we celebrate the class of 2021, we are joining the conversations between the newest recipients of TC's Medal for Distinguished Service and 3 members of the TC faculty. Tonight we feature Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. The day after the Sandy Hook school shooting in 2012, this mother of 5 started a Facebook group focused on reducing gun violence in the United States. She was soon joined by other concerned moms. Their online conversations led this self-described accidental activist to launch Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. Shannon Watts has been called the NRA's worst nightmare, and for good reason. And when she talks, decision makers listen. Moms Demand Action has flipped the makeup of state legislatures. They've convinced politicians to make common sense gun reform a central campaign point. The group has put new gun laws on the books in red, blue, and purple states. Her recent book, Fight Like a Mother, is aptly named. Undeterred by threats of violence, she remains confident sensible gun legislation and regulation can be a reality. Joining Shannon tonight is another valiant leader in halting gun violence, Teachers College's own Sonali Rajan, Associate Professor of Health Education. Sonali has helped debunk the myth that mentally ill teens are the primary perpetrators of youth gun violence, documenting instead a much stronger association with a perceived lack of safety and previous exposure to violence, which reflect broader systemic issues. Sonali has shown that failure by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to classify gun violence exposure as an adverse childhood experience deprives children and their families of access to desperately needed psychological and other support services. Through research, public speaking, and her co-founding of Columbia University's SURGE Coalition, Sonali has consistently advocated for policies and practices to end America's gun violence epidemic. Good evening, and welcome to the first in a series of convocation celebrations where we honor the newest recipients of the Teachers College Medal for Distinguished Service. I'm glad you've joined us, especially our 2021 graduates and their families. Congratulations to you all. Awarding the Medal for Distinguished Service is always a highlight of Convocation Week. Our past honorees in human health include the public health leader, Dr. Helene Gayle, former U.S. Secretary for Health and Human Services, Donna Shalala, Melissa Fleming, Chief Spokesperson for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the pioneering movement scientist, Antoinette Gentile. We've honored past recipients for their pioneering efforts in civil and human rights, activism, politics, journalism, education, and the arts. While their achievements are diverse, all share a common link. They represent the best of our ideals that the college stands for, fostering a culture of excellence and demonstrating true leadership to make a real difference in our communities, our country, and our world. Now I'm delighted to invite tonight's featured speakers, Shannon Watts and Professor Sonali Rajan, to the virtual stage. Welcome to both, and congratulations, Shannon.
Thank you. It's such an honor.
We're delighted to have you join the TC family tonight. Now I would like to turn the program over to you both.
Hi, Shannon. It is such a privilege to be here with you tonight, and it's so good to see you.
Thank you.
We're going to dive into a whole set of questions this evening. We have about an hour together. But before we did that, I just wanted to say and acknowledge how grateful we are for the work that you do. I have followed your work and your evidence-informed advocacy, which we teach here at TC to our students for many years now. And Moms Demand Action now has, I believe, 6 million members and has chapters in every single state. So it is just a phenomenal organization. And we're just, again, so grateful for the work that you do in this space. So with that being said, I thought we could just dive right in into our first question and just begin a little bit of a conversation about the work that you are doing and how it ties to probably what we might consider as one of the greatest public health crises here in the United States. So first, what are some of the deeply held narratives and or myths that persist and seem to just make these conversations about solutions to gun violence so emotionally and politically charged?
You know, the gun lobby has a decades-long head start, many decades of spreading misinformation and disinformation. And as a result, we hear kind of the same arguments and discussions come up over and over again. For example, that this isn't a gun issue, that gun violence is somehow created by mental health issues in America. Mm-hmm. And we know when we look at the data, which is, as you mentioned, something our organization is very focused on, is research and data to make an informed decision around policy. The whole world struggles with mental health issues. In fact, our peer nations have very similar rates of mental illnesses as America does. But what is different is easy access to guns. And that is why we have a 25 times higher gun homicide rate than any other high-income country. The other thing we know about mental illness is that very often people who are mentally ill are victims of violent crime. They're not the perpetrators. And so we see really the gun lobby and lawmakers and others who are beholden to them blame things like mental health or video games or culture at large. And it's really sort of a straw man. It's a tactic to distract from the real issue, which we know, again, based on data, is easy access to guns, even for people with a criminal history. The other myth we often hear is that more guns equals less crime, and the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Mm-hmm. But if you do the math, which is that there are about 320 million people in America, there are at least 400 million guns, one for every person in the country. And in addition, we know about 50 million additional guns were sold in the last year. Mm-hmm. If more guns and fewer gun laws made us safer, we would be the safest country in the world. And yet we have a gun homicide rate, again, that's 25 times higher than other high-income countries. So that is a myth. That isn't true. And, there's no way to ensure that it's always a good guy who has a gun. Sometimes good guys turn into bad guys. It doesn't make any sense. It's sort of a specious argument. And in a high-stakes decision, it's really difficult for even trained professionals like police to hit their intended targets, and they are considered good guys with guns. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I would say the myth that we hear often is that I and organizations like Moms Demand Action, that we're anti-gun and that we want to take your guns away. And that isn't true. Many of our volunteers are gun owners or their partners are gun owners. This is simply about restoring the responsibilities that should go along with gun rights. In fact, when we poll gun owners in this country, only 1 in 10 of whom even belong to the NRA, we know they support common sense policies like a background check on every gun sale. So, hopefully it's clear to everyone that we are not advocating for the abolition of guns or the Second Amendment. We are anti-gun violence, not anti-gun. And our movement is filled with responsible gun owners. We are simply advocating for common sense solutions to this epidemic.
I think a lot about exactly that. How do we coexist safely with firearms? And I think the challenge of doing that comes with, and I love that you use that word responsibility, because that's exactly what it is. The same way we expect car owners to be responsible for their cars and what happens when they're using it. And so I think there's so many analogies we can draw to other public health issues and the way we've addressed other crises. So I appreciate you bringing all of that to light here. So, just to sort of build along that line of questioning, guns and of course how to effectively prevent gun violence, exactly as you were just describing. Some folks say, more guns equal less crime, and that's a favorite talking point by some. And then but the science sort of conversely very much shows that more guns do not do that. And so we do see these sort of divides. But this is one of the most divisive topics in what some might argue is a deeply divided nation. Now, you have somehow managed to just transcend partisan politics. You have worked to pass new laws in many states, including some with Republican governors. Now, how have you done this? And do you feel that the lessons that you have learned are applicable to other divisive issues?
Yeah, I think it is applicable. I mean, when we started Moms Demand Action, which is now with Students Demand Action, part of Every Town for Gun Safety, it's the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country. We decided that we were going to be moderate, nonpartisan, and we felt strongly that the only way to win on any social issue, marriage equality, I think, is a good example of one, is to get Democrats and Republicans alike on the right side of history. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. I wish it did. But the system is set up for incremental change. And if you give up on that incremental change, you'll never get to the place of a revolution, which is where I think we are now in this country on this issue. And so we set out from the very beginning to change hearts and minds with data and with anecdotes and with stories and with relationships. And if you look at the history of this issue, it really has been this small group of extremists who have dominated the conversation and the lobbying efforts historically on gun safety. And they kind of got everything they wanted. And there was a very vocal minority and a very silent majority. And so that vocal minority has essentially written our gun laws for decades. Before Moms Demand Action started, this agenda of gun lobbyists was just sailing through state houses. And they got so much of what they wanted. And they never imagined, I don't think, that average citizens would coalesce and fight back against what has been one of the wealthiest, most powerful lobbying organizations that's ever existed in American history. But when we started back in 2013, it's important to remember, it was end of 2012, that about a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had A ratings from the NRA. Today, none do. And that's because election cycle after election cycle, we've shown lawmakers that if they do the right thing, we'll have their back. And if they do the wrong thing, we'll have their job. And that takes a while. And we are creating excellent relationships with Republicans as well and independents. But that is going to take, I think, a longer amount of time. It's important to remember that the only place where this is a polarizing issue is in the US Senate. Because when you look at America broadly, 90% of Americans support background checks, 89% of Republicans, 87% of gun owners. And so we had to build this movement that would allow Democrats, for example, to vote their conscience. Again, if you go back to 2013, when a bill called Manchin-Toomey was put forward after the Sandy Hook school shooting, it failed by 6 votes of the Senate. 4 of those senators were Democrats. And I think the really important lesson they learned was with friends like the NRA, who needs enemies, because they thought by voting against background checks, they would have the support of the gun lobby. And the gun lobby sort of turned right around and invested in their Republican opponents. And so what we had to do was build this equal movement. And in fact, we're larger than the NRA now, that could combat the misinformation of the gun lobby, to show elected officials that this grassroots army would protect them and would not if they didn't do the right thing. And so that just is going on election cycle after election cycle, and really building the relationships and the momentum that we need to point the right president and the right Congress in the right direction. And I think that can be applied to any issue.
I really love what you're sharing with us, and I'm also a mom. I have a 5.5-year-old, and what I think one of the things I've observed, I think in watching your work and in learning from the work that you have done is, in some ways, you have really just so beautifully honed in on sort of that universal experience of what parenting is or caregiving is. So anyone with a child in their life and or who, who might be concerned about this issue in any way can resonate, I think, with the messaging that you have put forth. So I really just appreciate that and how you've chosen to be really on the side of evidence here and using that to inform the ways in which you have advocated for specific policies, specific changes. And so that's just something I just wanted to note and appreciate. And sort of in that vein, then, you know, you have advocated for and successfully so many legislative changes across the country, as we talked about in blue and red and purple states. But what further legislative changes do you believe are really the most important ones to make in order to end or even to reduce the harm associated with gun violence? And maybe building on that, what are some of your hopes for what you imagine the Biden administration might be able to accomplish in the months and years to come?
So I think it's important to start the answer with some context, because I am often asked, don't you feel hopeless? Aren't you sad that nothing has happened? And really nothing could be further from the truth. Not even just the fact alone that Moms Demand Action happened, but after the horrific school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, we, as I mentioned, lost on Mansion Toomey, a bill we thought, would pass and we'd all go sort of back to our normal lives. And this would clearly be something that lawmakers would act on in the wake of a horrific tragedy like that. And as we all know, they didn't. But because they didn't act and because there was such anger and outrage on that, we pivoted and started doing this work in state houses and in boardrooms and in school boards and in city councils all across the country. That's what we've been doing for the last 8.5 years. It's important to remember that we have passed background checks in 22 states and Washington, D.C. We have passed red flag laws in 19 states and D.C. We have closed something called the Charleston loophole in 19 states and D.C. We've passed laws that disarm domestic abusers in 29 states and D.C. The House, which is now solidly gun sense, they have passed 4 gun safety bills just this last month. And President Biden has announced a whole slate of executive actions that do everything from regulate ghost guns to funding community violence intervention programs to establishing red flag law, sort of a model legislation for that in states. And then finally, a director of the ATF has been nominated. And all eyes are on the Senate. But all of that work has been done behind the scenes. Yeah. We have stopped the NRA's agenda in state houses year after year for the last 5 years, 90% of the time. We've changed corporate policies at hundreds of restaurants and retailers. We've taught people about secure gun storage. Over 1 million families have received our Be Smart materials. And it goes on and on and on, really, this work. But now what we're seeing is really that COVID has exacerbated the gun violence crisis in this country. Gun violence is really an epidemic within a pandemic. And this is gun violence that doesn't make national headlines, right? It's the daily gun violence that tears at our communities, particularly in city centers. And then sadly, as we return to normal in America, that also means the return of public shootings, like we've seen in Indianapolis and Atlanta and Boulder, and on and on. So we know we're all only as safe as the closest state with the weakest gun laws. And that's why we are fighting for these new federal laws that look at the data where they've been passed in states that show that they work, and that if they were applied nationally, they would save even more lives. So, this is really all about, you were talking about being a mom. I think moms are sort of uniquely cut out for the unglamorous, time-consuming, often heartbreaking heavy lifting of grassroots activism. And doing that work, it's like drips on a rock, and it has led us to this point. And we would like to see the federal government pass these laws that we've been able to pass at the state level. But this work is a marathon, not a sprint. It's going to take several election cycles to get us to where we need to be. But I'm really confident and feeling very heartened that we're moving in the right direction.
All of that is so heartening. And my colleagues and I who work in this space, I think we toggle between feeling exactly as you described, very optimistic and also very determined to, think about this issue in a way that, and acknowledge that it is very preventable. And we do have solutions that are potentially very effective, and we need the will and the courage to pursue them. One thing I really, I'm hearing, and for our students, especially who are watching, I think one of the things you're highlighting is also that gun violence occurs in multiple forms. You mentioned public shootings, mass shootings, which we tend to hear about quite a bit in the media, but also, as many of the pieces of legislation you were just describing talk through suicide by firearm, or it would impact that kind of violence, or domestic violence in homes and things like that. So, what is so impressive about the kinds of pieces of legislation you are advocating for is that they play a role in addressing the various different types of gun violence that do persist here in the U.S. in such tragic forms. And so in that part of it, understanding that nuance is so important. So thank you for bringing that piece up. We, of course, have talked about, you've mentioned the NRA a couple times, and I think, this is something I don't know that I fully understood until fairly recently, and I think this might be interesting for everyone to hear a little bit more about, and that is, why has the National Rifle Association historically exerted so much power on this issue? And you hinted at this a little bit, but are we starting to see some change?
We are. And really, there was no counterweight, interestingly, to the NRA. When I started Moms Demand Action, I went online first. I was living in Indiana, and I went online and I looked for something like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but for gun safety. I was a teen in the 80s, and MAD was so incredibly influential and made such a difference in our culture. And I knew that I wanted to be part of a badass army of women. And what I found were sort of these one-off think tanks, mostly run by men, some state and city organizations, again, mostly run by men, not connected nationally. And, I don't know that I imagined we'd be a counterweight to the NRA, but I knew the only thing that would frighten lawmakers more than gun lobbyists were angry mothers. And when I talk about moms, we are now mothers and others. We're also students, not just women, but we're mostly led by women. And I think it's so important because there are only certain levers of power that women can pull, right? We're only about 20% of the 500,000 elected positions in this country. We're only about 5% of Fortune 1000 CEOs, but we're the majority of the voting public. We make the majority of the spending decisions for our families. I mean, there's certain levers of power that we can pull. And I do believe it was the NRA's worst nightmare that women would rise up against them in their communities and fight back. And so here we are, 8.5 years later, our movement has never been stronger. And yet the NRA has never been weaker. And that is in large part because, we have been shining a spotlight on their misdeeds now for nearly a decade. Certainly mismanagement of their organization, sweetheart deals, and misspending as a so-called nonprofit organization. They've been under investigation for being allegedly a foreign asset to Russia. And so this A rating from the NRA, which used to be a badge of honor, is now in many ways a scarlet letter. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing their power, their political sway wane. And I think that's an incredibly important movement and time for us to act on this issue while they're sort of sidelined. Our organization in the last month has been engaged in a cross-country road trip. We showed senators and that there is bipartisan support for background checks. Meanwhile, the NRA was in bankruptcy court, and we traveled tens of thousands of miles, made many COVID-safe stops along this journey where we had a banner, and it went, from basically Alaska to Washington, D.C., and again, making the case for passing stronger gun laws. And so as long as the NRA, is as bankrupt financially as it is morally, I think it's important to take advantage of the moment and work to pass the strongest gun laws possible.
The irony is, and my understanding is, that the NRA historically was actually a gun safety organization, or that was some of the impetus for their sort of the origins of them as an organization. And I think it's really interesting now that those of us working on the sides of anti-gun violence are sort of using that term gun safety to really help capitalize and explain exactly what it is we're trying to do. And I think your work and your advocacy of you and the millions of volunteers and members of Moms Demand Action are doing that. So I was just thinking about that the other day, that there is this little bit of a funny full circle moment in some ways about the origins of the NRA and where we are now. So my next question is actually a little bit of a selfish one, as someone who does research in this space. And so maybe you'll indulge me a little bit on this. As you well know, the scientific study of the prevention of gun violence has been historically deeply underfunded. And now we are recently seeing some increased investments in federal funding for this kind of work, which is very encouraging. I think it was the 2021 congressional spending bill appropriated about $25 million for this work. So, we see sort of a little bit of a light there in the tunnel, maybe not the end of the tunnel. But what are the kinds of questions that you hope researchers might seek to ask and answer?
Yeah, I mean, for years, the federal government has been limited in how much funding could be allocated to gun violence research, and that was no accident. I mean, that's certainly what the gun lobby wanted. In 1996, there was an amendment called the Dickey Amendment. It was basically a congressional budget restriction that passed, and it severely underfunded this research through the CDC and the NIH, again, on purpose. It was strategic. But then in 2019, and that was for the first time in decades, Congress actually passed a funding bill that appropriated $25 million for gun violence research. And that was something our organization advocated for and our volunteers asked for. But certainly, we need more. This is an epidemic that kills 100 Americans and wounds at least 230 more every single day. So if I were a researcher, I would specifically focus on, for example, measuring the effect of intra and interstate gun laws. As I said, we're all only as safe as the closest state with the weakest gun laws. And so just seeing what the impact is between those states with weak gun laws and those with strong. Also researching the implementation and enforcement of gun laws. Something we have learned over and over again is that it's not just enough to pass a law. You have to make sure that it's implemented correctly, and then you have to make sure it's being enforced. I think the red flag law is a really good example of that. A red flag law, depending on the state, allows families and police to petition a judge to get a restraining order that temporarily removes the guns from someone who is a risk to themselves or others. One of the very first laws, the first red flag laws, was passed in 2005, and it was in Indiana. And we all know, probably if you've been listening to the news, that sadly, the gunman in Indianapolis was able to buy a gun, even though his parents had warned police that he was a danger to himself and others, even though he had been put in a mental health hold against his will. He was still able to go out and buy semi-automatic rifles. And had that law been implemented correctly, so it's much more comprehensive in states where it's been passed recently, it's much more modern, and then enforced. We know that they didn't even really bother to try to enforce the red flag law and keep guns away from this potentially dangerous person in that state. So again, once the law is passed, researching how it's implemented and enforced, and then researching how gun violence varies across cities and the role that violence intervention programs play in mitigating gun violence. When we look at cities that have programs like Ceasefire or Youth Alive, those programs that train adults and teens to have relationships that are important in the community, to hear about gun violence before it happens, and then to intervene and mitigate that gun violence, we know the data shows that these programs work. Through executive action, we think there'll be, about $1 billion that is invested in these programs. But it's really important for these programs to be researched, best practices, and then apply them in other places. Then researching how to predict those who are at risk for suicide. You mentioned suicide earlier. We know in particular there are high-risk groups such as veterans and older males. We're seeing a horrific epidemic of gun violence or gun suicide among teens. It seems to be growing exponentially. And looking at ways to address suicidal ideation, particularly for those who have easy access to firearms. And finally, I would say studying community trauma from gun violence. It really does require expanding the focus of the impact of gun violence, not just from from death and injuries, but to including those who have been exposed directly and indirectly. And it really does seem like these episodes of gun violence, which are so traumatizing to families, also spread out into communities. I mean, you can't imagine, when you think about the 17-year-old, for example, who was shot and killed by a school resource officer in his bathroom in his high school just a couple of weeks ago. Imagine what that does to teachers who are worried that their students are armed. Imagine what it does to police officers whose job should really be to break up fights. Imagine what it does to students whose fellow student was just killed in their bathroom, a place, a high school where they should feel safest. So I think, again, that kind of research is really important and underfunded and not right now being done widely.
I hope all the students who are watching are taking good notes. These are all great, exactly the kinds of research questions we would hope to be able to pursue in through so many different disciplines. And exactly as you're describing, the nature of gun violence is that it impacts not just those who are shot and killed, but also those who have witnessed gunfire or hear gunshots or have a friend or a family member who has been lost to gun violence. All the communities, like the ripple effect of the impact of gun violence is, I think, truly difficult to really quantify.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you bringing that to the fore here in this conversation, because that trauma is very real. One of the things you mentioned teachers and the ways in which schools are impacted, and that is selfishly a little bit my area of work. So I just wanted to highlight something that you said, which is that, what does this do to teachers? What does this do to kids who know that this happened and now have to go back to class and take a test, or to, perform in school and to engage academically with their peers and with one another? And when we think about the connections between health and learning, I think so much about the ways in which schools are expected to be safe spaces, and the ways in which the persistence of gun violence really takes that away. There is a piece of legislation from the 80s that says something along the lines of that public schools should be spaces that are free from, not just free from violence, but peaceful environments. And I always think about that in the context of where we are now, where that is not always the case, and it is not something that can necessarily be assumed, and the ways in which we all sort of have a collective responsibility to think about how we not just ensure that schools and other communities are free from violence, but also that they are places in which children can thrive, in which educators can thrive, in which parents can raise their families. So all of what you're bringing to our conversation here is just highlighting the enormous scope of this problem. So thank you for doing that. Kind of along the lines of some of the research, kind of the research direction, some of the work that I have done and work of my colleagues here at TC, across Columbia, and of course at other institutions, have really focused on non-policy oriented solutions to address this endemic. And so just some examples, thinking about trauma-informed practices in K through 12 schools, or increased access to mental health care, or investments in community green space, or improvements in public housing. Are these kinds of solutions, do you see these kinds of ideas having some sort of traction among gun safety groups or other anti-gun violence groups?
Yeah, it's such an important point. When I started Moms Demand Action, I was a white suburban mom who was afraid my kids weren't safe in their schools. That is what got me off the sidelines. Shame on me for not realizing that it isn't just about mass shootings or school shootings. That's about 1% of all the gun violence in this country. It's really about the daily gun violence, whether, again, it's gun homicides or gun suicides or domestic gun violence, unintentional shootings. It's all tragic and in many cases senseless and preventable. And I get asked after a shooting tragedy, regardless of the cause or what happened, what one law would have stopped that, right? That's always sort of the comeback from people who oppose gun safety. And the truth is, there isn't a quote unquote silver bullet, right? It is going to take a safety net of solutions. And I always liken it to car safety. Back in the 70s, car fatalities started to grow exponentially. And so the government decided to get involved and safety advocates. And it wasn't like they just passed seatbelt laws and car accidents stopped or car fatalities. You know, they did pass a seatbelt law, but they also reduced speed limits in many places. They also put rumble strips on roads. They also improved car technology. I mean, there were so many different things that went into dramatically reducing car fatalities. Do people still die in car accidents? Unfortunately, yes. You know, there are 400 million guns in this country. There is no way to prevent all episodes of gun violence, but there is a way to stop many of them, and there is a way to save American lives. And so we have prioritized partnerships and funding for organizations that have been working in communities for decades, right? They have been at the forefront of fighting for gun safety in their communities, often Black and Brown Americans, people in America who are really doing the heavy lifting and the hard work invisibly. You know, this is not gun violence that often makes headlines, sadly, in this country. And so, you know, our strategies have really evolved and expanded greatly over the years to include supporting and funding outreach, group violence intervention programs, crime prevention through environmental design, hospital-based violence intervention programs where you go and you're discussing this issue with victims and survivors, safe passage programs, even cognitive behavioral therapy. And I am really heartened by the fact that, as I mentioned, the executive actions that President Biden put forward would repurpose about $1 billion in existing federal funding to support these organizations that have relationships in their community and intervene in gun violence. But also, President Biden has proposed $5 billion as part of his infrastructure package that would also support these programs. So I think we're going to see more and more of this. And again, when you look at how COVID exacerbated gun violence, the horrific violence that's taking place, the uptick in violence in city centers has to be addressed, and we have to fund programs that can go a long way toward saving lives.
I do think about this a lot. I worry sometimes that maybe we would pass, let's say, universal background checks, but gun violence would still persist. Maybe it would reduce some of the number of deaths or injuries, but we would still see gun violence. And then people might say, look, gun laws don't work. You pass universal background checks. And it's that pun, that silver bullet pun is very apt here, which is exactly that. There is no silver bullet. And I would add to that, I think you also just highlighted that sort of what we would consider a harm reduction approach, which our students here do learn, especially in psychology and here in health education, learn quite a bit about. But this notion that any reduction in harm, even 1 life saved, 10 lives saved, 10 communities that are no longer impacted, I mean, that are, you know, less impacted, any reduction in harm is beneficial. So I appreciate you highlighting all of the different ways in which prevention of this issue could come together in a really meaningful way. I have one more question before we move over to some questions from our audience, and that is, after the Parkland school shooting in 2018, we saw students across the country mobilizing to try and lead reform efforts. Have their efforts continued, and how important do you think it is for youth to be speaking out on these issues?
It's so incredibly important. You know, there will always be a need for gun safety activists and advocates because, again, if you compare it to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, it isn't as though, you know, the lobbying organizations go away when you win. You have to win, and then you have to protect those wins. Otherwise, you will slide backwards. And you know, this generation, those who are watching and graduating now, many of you are what we refer to as the lockdown generation. You know, I grew up hiding under my desk as if that desk was going to protect me from nuclear fallout during the Cold War. And we're asking the next generation to essentially rehearse their deaths in the bathroom of a classroom as though the bathroom door, that piece of wood, is going to protect them from the spray of an AR-15. And they're angry, and they should be angry because, you know, the fact that lawmakers have done nothing at a federal level now for 25 years is outrageous. But, I'm so incredibly inspired by the younger generation. Students Demand Action was a pilot program when the Parkland tragedy happened, and it just grew so quickly. And it's now the largest youth-led gun violence prevention movement in the country. We have over 400 local Students Demand Action groups all across the country. And when they were sort of unexpectedly home from school, whether it was high school or college, they used a lot of that extra time to advocate for gun safety. And it was amazing to see, how that activism is different than my own, because in many ways they're more fluent, for example, with technology, and they just have a different way of doing things and looking at things that I think energizes the movement overall. And in fact, Students Demand Action registered over 100,000 new voters in the last election cycle.
Oh, God, that's fabulous. Yeah.
It is. It's amazing. And I'm seeing so many of them now sort of step up and take the mic and really be incredibly important and diverse advocates for this issue. And, I would just say it can be exhausting to be an advocate, especially when you're going up against a powerful special interest. But, I'm encouraged because I know we're making progress. I often say that working on gun violence prevention is a marathon, not a sprint, but it's also a relay race, right? And you have to pass that baton to other generations. And they're not content with the status quo. It took me years to find my voice and to become an activist. And so to see people who don't wait until they're in their 40s speak up and stand up and hold their elected officials accountable is really inspiring.
I love that. That is inspiring. I got chills as you were talking. So thank you for talking through that with us a little bit. I'm going to just shift over because we have some questions from our audience that include many of our graduating students, of course. So one question is, how much impact, if any, can corporations in particular have in the fight against gun violence? And so some corporations have taken, very clear-cut actions like Dick's Sporting Goods. But what could a company, let's say, in an open carry state do to make their communities safer? And are there maybe other paths for corporations to have an impact?
Yes. So when I started Moms Demand Action, I would say it was June of 2013. So about 6 months after I started the organization, I saw on the news that Starbucks was no longer going to allow smoking or even electronic cigarettes 20 feet outside their stores, regardless of state law. So I called Starbucks and I said, well, are you still going to allow the open carry of guns? Because we had seen that they were allowing this inside their stores. And they said, yes, we're going to still follow the law as it pertains to guns. And we were so small as an organization, because we were only 6 months old, that we couldn't even do a boycott, right? We could only do skip Starbucks Saturdays. And we started this campaign knowing that we were more afraid of secondhand bullets than secondhand smoke. And within 3 months, the CEO of Starbucks, after we made images of open carry inside Starbucks go viral, and after we boycotted their stores on Saturdays and showed how we were enjoying coffee at their competitors or at our houses, they said, no, guns are no longer welcome inside our stores. And we realized we were onto something, that women in particular had a lot of power when it came to how we were going to spend our dollars. And we went after many other companies, put pressure on them, changed their policies around guns. And then what we saw was the more we did that, the more there were companies who either didn't want to be the focus of our campaign, or they were really companies that were on the right side of history and wanted to do the right thing and came to us proactively and said, like, how do we do this the right way? I think Dick's is a great example of a company that really has been on the right side of history. After Parkland, they changed so many policies, including how many guns they sold. Believe it or not, Walmart has been a very good actor on this issue. Everything from how they conduct background checks, which is sort of state of the art, to no longer selling AR-15s and no longer allowing open carry. So hundreds of restaurants and retailers have listened to us. And then I think the other piece of this that is important for advocates to think about is we have also had companies local at a state level be part of our constituency when we go and either argue against bad bills or support good gun bills. And in Oklahoma, for example, we had a lot of companies and athletic teams and even celebrities and influencers who said, don't pass this open carry bill, and it failed. So, I do think that it's important that when you are creating this coalition of people in the community, whether it's educators or medical professionals, parents, police, whatever, it should also include corporations because they're a really important key constituent.
Thank you. No, I think I didn't actually know the Starbucks story. I think that's great, and way to build off of another public health issue. Like, I mean, that's such a brilliant move. So, thank you for sharing that. The next question that we have from one of our audience members is, as a 2021 graduate going into the mental health sector, so a student who's going to become a therapist, what role do you feel that mental health care providers play in intervention programs specific to the prevention of gun violence?
I think it's very key, and I certainly think there is an important role for, first of all, understanding people who are at risk, again, to themselves or others. Gun suicide, about 2/3 of all the gun deaths in this country, 40,000 every year, are gun suicides. And so recognizing suicidal ideation in the populations I pointed out earlier, it seems like there's a real lack of mental health resources and practitioners that people can access. Also talking with people about, do they have guns and how are they stored? We have a program called Be Smart. You can go to besmartforkids.org, where we talk to people about how do you have these conversations about how guns should be stored. About 5 million kids in America live in homes with unsecured guns, and sadly, those are all too often used by children or teens in gun suicides or even gun homicides. And in fact, most gun homicides in this country, many of them are committed by people who are between the ages of 18 and 21. So recognizing those warning signs, I think, is very important as well. And then finally, I would say, the research role that we were talking about earlier, really dedicating or focusing on this issue as part of the work you do as a mental health care practitioner would go a long way in helping us address our crisis at the state or federal level.
That's so helpful, and that was a wonderful question. So thank you to everyone who's sending questions in. I believe we have time for one more audience question. Now, this is one of my doctoral students who just graduated. So newly minted Dr. DePaula. But her questions are, what is the NRA's end game? That's a good question. You never really thought about what is their kind of end goal? And then, are there efforts to treat the gun industry like the tobacco industry, requiring financial underwriting, remedial action, that kind of thing, in the context of gun violence prevention? So great questions, Elise.
It's a great question. What's the NRA's end game? I can tell you. It is easy access to guns for anyone, anywhere, anytime, no questions asked. That is absolutely their end goal. Because they are not a gun safety organization. They are a gun lobbying organization that exists solely to protect the profits of gun manufacturers. And that we've allowed them to have a role in our lawmaking process is obscene. Because at the end of the day, it really is about profit for them. When you talk about the tobacco industry, it's really interesting because the gun lobby has learned so much from the tobacco industry and the trials and tribulations that they experienced. And one thing they learned was that they needed immunity from lawsuits. And so Congress passed something called PLCAA, P-L-C-A-A, and it's a law that basically gives gun manufacturers immunity from being sued over their products. That is, they saw the tobacco industry and their biggest liability was that they were able to get sued. And that's how they lost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's how they weakened their power as a lobbying organization. They didn't want the same thing to happen to them. So they have this very unique protection, which I know Democratic lawmakers are very eager to undo, and that can be undone, but it has to be done through the legislative process. But in the meantime, we're seeing these families who are victims and survivors of gun violence actually find doors in through PLCAA and find ways to sue gun manufacturers. For example, the Sandy Hook families, some of them have a lawsuit that has really started to wind its way through the courts and has been very successful. And the most interesting thing will be what they find in discovery. But when we talk about what has the gun lobby learned from the tobacco industry. It's not what we've learned and what we're going to hold them accountable for. It's sort of undoing the damage that they've done by making sure they don't go the same route as the tobacco industry.
That's exactly, yeah, that's exactly it. Thank you, and thank you, Elise. Those are good questions. So my last question for you, and I really actually would love to end sort of on a more hopeful note, which is, what is your message to our 2021 graduates at this very difficult moment, and what do you hope that they can accomplish?
I would say that we should all be incredibly hopeful. If nothing else, myself and every Moms Demand Action volunteer is proof positive that everyone can make a difference if you are determined and if you find something you're passionate about and you get involved and you get off the sideline and you use your voice and your vote on an issue. I would say, first of all, don't be afraid of failure. I am a very type A person who had a long corporate career in communications before I started Moms Demand Action. And I knew nothing about gun violence or organizing or even the legislative system. I certainly was not an expert. But if I had waited until I knew everything there was to know to get started, I still wouldn't have started Moms Demand Action. I sort of built the plane as I flew it. I jumped in. And so did so many Moms Demand Action volunteers from all across the country. And I just trusted these perfect strangers that together we would accomplish this. And if we didn't, what was the worst thing that could happen? We would fail. And I was certain someone else could do it. So I think it's so important to find an issue that you're passionate about, to commit to that issue, to get off the sideline. Alice Walker has this quote, which is, activism is my rent for living on the planet. It's the rent I pay for living on the planet. And I think that's so true. My rent is personally being a gun safety activist. That's the issue I'm focused on. And you don't have to make it a full-time job. You can carve out a few hours from your week or your month. And it might be any issue that you're interested in. But I think the most important thing you can do is recognize that you need to play an active role in creating the world that you want to live in.
Well, thank you so much, Shannon. I feel like we could talk all evening, but I'm being told we have to wrap up just for the sake of time here. So what I'd love to do now is turn things back to our provost for some closing remarks. Thank you so much again, Shannon. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you.
What an amazing conversation. My goodness. Thank you both for participating in this important discussion and for your ongoing dedication and commitment to keeping our children, families, and communities safe. Shannon, again, I welcome you to the TC family and congratulations on receiving the Medal for Distinguished Service. It's a well-deserved honor in recognition of your efforts, conviction, and achievements. Finally, congratulations to the TC class of 2021. Our graduates and their families are testaments to the hallmarks we're celebrating throughout this week: determination, excellence, leadership, and joy. And please remember to tune in for the continuation of our TC Medalist series, tomorrow night featuring medalist Mahzarin Banaji and TC professor Karen Block. Thank you all and good night.